welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're unpacking a historical paradox, one that really challenges how we view South Asian sociology.
Yeah, it's a fascinating one.
Right, because if you trace the history of this one single group of people, you find them recorded as high caste royalty, like ruling these vast ancient kingdoms.
Exactly, kings and rulers.
But then, and this is the paradox, in certain regions today, you find that same community living as semi-nomadic forest herders, and they are actively fighting for just, basic rights to the land they've lived on for centuries. So how does one community navigate both ends of that socioeconomic spectrum?
Well, I mean, we often fall into this trap, right, of viewing history as a straight line. We assume a group just remains static as either the conqueror or the conquered. You're either the settler or you're the nomad.
Right.
But reality, especially in this specific region, is just much more fluid than that.
And to trace that fluidity, our mission today relies on a really comprehensive Wikipedia entry covering the Gurjars. Sometimes pronounced Gurjars, depending on where you are.
Yeah, both are used.
We're tracking this highly diverse agricultural and pastoral community across India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. And we really want to look at how they shape South Asian history and, honestly, how they interact with very rigid modern borders.
Which is so relevant right now, because for anyone listening who wants to understand the actual mechanics of human identity, religion, and borders in practice, I mean, far beyond the neat little lines drawn on political maps, the story of the Gurjars serves as the ultimate masterclass.
It really does.
It reveals how societies actually build and rebuild themselves over millennia.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the etymology.
Yeah.
Because the term Gurjar carries some serious historical weight.
It definitely does.
According to ancient Sanskrit texts, the root gur translates to enemy, and ujar translates to destroyer.
Yeah.
Put them together, and you get destroyer of the enemy.
Which is quite a formidable title.
Yeah, no kidding.
But what that title signifies today is incredibly dynamic. Depending on where you travel in South Asia, Gurjar doesn't mean just one thing. In some administrative contexts, it functions as a caste.
Right. In others, it's officially recognized as a tribe. You also see it represent a biradari, which is a kinship group, or even a qawm, which translates a bit more closely to a nation.
And linguistically, they're just as diverse.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. They adapt to their surroundings, so they speak Hindi, Urdu, Pashto, or Kashmiri, while still maintaining their own distinct language, which is Gujari.
And that adaptability, it extends deeply into their religious practices as well. Our sources cite a demographic breakdown from a few decades ago, and it really highlights just how varied this population is across different geographies. Could you walk us through those numbers?
Yeah, the statistics from 1988 are actually quite striking. Roughly 53% of the total Gurjar population follows Islam.
Wow.
And then about 46.8% follow Hinduism. And there's a smaller fraction, around 0.2%, that practice Sikhism.
So you have this single overarching ethnic or tribal identity that successfully contains multiple major world religions. What's fascinating here is how that identity might have originally coalesced. Several historians propose that Gurjara started out as the name of a Janapada.
A Janapada being
A tribal kingdom or territory. This would be emerging around 570 CE in present-day Rajasthan and Gujarat. Over generations, that geographic, territorial name gradually morphed into an ethnic identity.
which creates a massive puzzle for modern historians, I imagine.
Oh, absolutely. When ancient texts mention a Gurjar Raja or a Gurjar king, we have to stop and determine, wait, were they a king of an ethnic group called the Gurjars, or simply a king who ruled over a territory bearing that name?
It's a complex historical detective story, but the texts we do have paint them as a major regional force. There's this biography from 630 CE called the Harsha-Charita,
Yes.
and it describes a certain king's father as being a constant threat to the sleep of Gurjar.
That's a great line.
It implies a really serious entrenched rivalry. I mean, if you are considered the primary threat to an entire kingdom's security, you are dealing with a heavily fortified, established power.
They were undeniably a recognized, formidable presence in northwestern India during that era. But their exact origins remain a subject of intense historical debate. Early theories speculated that they migrated into the region from Central Asia.
But modern consensus leans away from that.
Yeah, it does. The much more compelling historical mystery is their relationship to the Rajputs, which is India's famed traditional warrior class.
Right, because if you look at the traditional, mainstream historical narrative today, the Gurjar is frequently stereotyped simply as a rural herder.
Right.
There's even a persistent cultural myth attempting to explain away their past royal connections. The myth suggests that any Rajput lineage of Gurjar claims is merely the result of a Rajput man marrying a Brahmin woman, placing them as this sort of fallen warrior class.
But historian Tanya Jakothial's analysis fundamentally challenges that top-down narrative. When you look at the actual historical processes of state formation in that region, the evidence points in the exact opposite direction.
Okay, how so?
The Rajput warrior class did not exist as a separate, preordained elite that subsequently spawned these pastoral groups. Instead, the Rajput identity actually emerged from mobile, pastoral, and tribal communities like the Gurjars and the Jets.
That is wild.
Hmm.
So how does a nomadic herding community transform into a sedentary, aristocratic warrior class? What are the actual mechanics of that shift?
It comes down to resource control and the realities of medieval agrarian economies. These mobile groups were not just aimlessly wandering the landscape.
Right, they had purpose.
Exactly. Because of their mobility, they actively controlled vital trade routes. They managed vast, economically crucial herds of livestock, and they occasionally engaged in strategic, armed raids against settled agriculturalists.
So they were building power.
As they accumulated wealth and military leverage through these activities, certain powerful factions within the Gurjar community began to permanently settle down. They acquired agricultural land, fortified their new territories, and formed strategic marital alliances with other locally dominant families.
I see.
And over several generations, these specific settled lineages actively distanced themselves from their nomadic pastoral roots. They adopted a newly formalized Rajput identity to legitimize their status as a sedentary, landed elite.
So the nomads essentially built the aristocracy from the ground up.
Precisely.
That completely shifts how we understand early state formation in India. But if the nomads built the aristocracy, then the transition into the medieval period must have been incredibly disruptive to that balance of power. As the region became more turbulent, how did the ruling empires perceive the Gurjars?
They were often viewed as a significant administrative headache.
I can imagine.
If you read the writings of Babur, the founder of the Mughal Empire from around 1525, he explicitly details his frustrations. He describes Jats and Gujars pouring down from the hills in vast numbers during times of revolt, carrying off oxen and buffaloes.
Wow.
He even characterized them as being guilty of the severest oppression.
Which speaks to their enduring mobility, right?
Right.
And their refusal to easily submit to centralized authority. Now, this era is also marked by profound religious shifts. We mentioned their religious diversity earlier, and this medieval period is where much of that originates. The sources document waves of forced conversions to Islam over several centuries. Could you outline how that unfolded?
It was a protracted process, spanning hundreds of years. It starts around 1026 with Muhammad of Ghazna's military campaigns in Gujarat.
Okay.
Later on, Tamerlane's sacking of Delhi involved the forced conversion of Gurjars in areas like Awadh and Meerut. Fast forward to the 1700s, and the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb was aggressively converting Gurjars in Himachal Pradesh.
And the fallout from those conversions was severe. Our sources indicate that in many cases, newly converted Gurjars were subsequently driven off their ancestral lands by groups like the Pathans and Balochis.
Right.
They were pushed from being landowners or established herders directly into vagrancy, essentially overnight.
And that sudden forced displacement deeply influenced how they interacted with authority moving forward, straight through into the British colonial period in the 18th and 19th centuries. You see a dual survival strategy emerge.
What do you mean by a dual strategy?
Well, some Gurjars managed to maintain local power as chieftains. They ruled over smaller estates in places like Saharanpur and Dholpur, integrating themselves into the colonial tax hierarchy.
Okay, so playing the system.
Exactly. But others took a much more confrontational approach.
And that confrontational approach brings us to a highly memorable event in Delhi during British rule. The British administration had confiscated land belonging to local Gurjar villagers to construct this massive, opulent colonial mansion known as the Metcalfe House.
Right.
The Gurjars didn't just accept the displacement or file a legal grievance. They organized, marched on the estate, and literally sacked the mansion. They tore it apart because it stood on their stolen land.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it demonstrates exactly how the Gurjars survived centuries of relentless empire building. They were relentlessly pragmatic.
Yeah.
They adapted to the immediate pressures of their environment. If survival meant establishing themselves as tax-collecting chieftains within a colonial system, they utilized that path.
And if survival required tearing down the physical symbols of a state that had displaced them,
They executed that strategy as well.
which transitions us perfectly to how these ancient nomadic traditions clash with the modern bureaucratic state. I want to look at a specific group called the Van Gujars, or Forest Gujars, who live in the Shivalik Hills of Uttarakhand.
They're a really unique group.
They are. They represent a fascinating cultural synthesis. They practice Islam, yet their social structure relies on kinship clans that function very similarly to Hindu Gotras, which are these exogamous lineages tracing back to a common ancestor.
Their daily life is also a rare surviving example of true pastoral transhumance.
Transhumance being the seasonal migration.
Exactly. It's the practice of moving livestock from one grazing ground to another in a highly regulated seasonal cycle. For the Van Gujars, this means establishing temporary settlements at the foothills of the Himalayas during the harsh winter months.
Got it.
Then, as the snow melts and the weather warms up, entire families pack up their households. They undertake a grueling, multi-week migration up into the high alpine pastures for the summer, where the grazing is fresh.
The logistics of that migration are incredible to think about. They travel with these herds of semi-wild water buffalo, and their primary livelihood comes from selling the milk of these buffalo to local populations along their route.
Right.
But their relationship with the herd goes far beyond simple economics. They treat these animals with immense reverence, to the point where they absolutely refuse to eat them or sell them for slaughter. The buffalo are deeply integrated into their cultural identity.
But that historical lifestyle is currently colliding with modern conservation policies, specifically surrounding India's 2006 Forest Rights Act. State forest authorities are tasked with creating and maintaining reserved national parks.
Right.
Their standard policy framework dictates that human and livestock populations must be kept entirely out of these protected ecological zones to preserve flora and fauna.
Which creates a massive jurisdictional and cultural conflict. The Van Gujars argue that their nomadic grazing routes through these exact forests date back 1,000 years. Under the provisions of that very same 2006 Act, they claim legal rights as traditional forest dwellers.
It's a fundamental standoff between contemporary environmental zoning laws and indigenous historical land stewardship. We see a parallel tension regarding state recognition with the Bakarwals in the Jammu and Kashmir region.
The Bakarwals being another predominantly Muslim nomadic Gujar group.
Yes, and they constitute a significant portion of the scheduled tribe population there. However, community leaders consistently argue that their numbers are severely undercounted in official government censuses.
And the mechanics of that undercounting are frustratingly simple. The government conducts its census during specific times of the year. Because the Bakarwals practice transhumance, half of their population is actively migrating high up in the inaccessible Himalayan passes when the enumerators actually arrive.
The state's sedentary methodology completely fails to capture a mobile reality.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because these challenges aren't isolated to one country. Modern borders have essentially drawn arbitrary lines through vast interconnected kin networks. Let's trace this north into Afghanistan.
Home to an estimated 1.5 million Gurjars.
Primarily in the northeastern provinces, right? Our sources highlight a sobering event during the COVID-19 pandemic. What exactly unfolded there?
It really underscores the extreme marginalization these communities face in remote areas. In regions like Badakhshan, Gurjar populations operate with almost zero access to modern medical clinics or state health facilities.
So when the pandemic struck, they were completely isolated.
Totally on their own.
Out of sheer desperation, they began treating the virus using the meat of an animal called the andak. What makes this critical is that their own Gurjar tribal council had explicitly ruled that the meat of the andak was haram, or forbidden according to Islamic dietary law.
Right.
But the lack of state infrastructure pushed them to a point where survival overrode strict religious edicts.
It is a stark indicator of state absence. Now, if we look across the border into Pakistan, where Gujars account for an estimated 20% of the total population, the dynamic changes. Anthropologists studying the region have identified a phenomenon they term Gujarism.
Gujarism.
Yes, this is a highly organized form of kin network activism. The community leverages their biradari, their shared ancestral and kinship ties, to mobilize politically, economically, and sometimes militarily.
And the stakes of that mobilization can be incredibly high. Take the Swat Valley in 2008. There was a local Gujar community leader named Pirsamila, In response to the Pakistani Taliban advancing into their territory, he utilized these kinship networks to raise a private tribal army of roughly 10,000 men.
10,000 men, yeah.
He successfully organized these tribesmen to defend 20 different villages from militant takeover.
It was a massive, decentralized resistance effort. Tragically, his tribal forces were eventually outgunned and defeated by the Taliban. Samillah was executed, and to broadcast a warning against any further tribal resistance, the militants publicly hung his body.
It is a harrowing example of a community relying on its own historical networks for defense when state security apparatuses fail. Now, the form that resistance takes shifts dramatically depending on the local political framework.
Definitely.
Returning to India, specifically the state of Rajasthan, we see this mobilization directed squarely at the state itself. In 2006 and 2007, the Gurjar community initiated massive, frequently violent protests. Their core demand was a shift in their affirmative action classification from other backward class, or OBC, to scheduled tribe, or ST status.
And to understand the intensity of those protests, we really need to look at the socioeconomic mechanics of those classifications in India. We are analyzing this purely as a matter of historical fact and socioeconomic struggle.
Right, taking no political sides here.
Exactly. In India's affirmative action system, both OBC and ST statuses offer reservations in government jobs and educational institutions.
Yeah.
However, the OBC category is vast and incredibly competitive. It encompasses a massive percentage of the population.
Okay.
Scheduled tribe status, on the other hand, provides a more protected quota specifically tailored to marginalized indigenous or tribal groups. For a community like the Gurjars in Rajasthan, who were feeling acute economic pressure, facing severe agricultural stagnation, and struggling to secure modern livelihoods, competing in the massive OBC pool was proving untenable.
So securing ST status wasn't just about prestige.
No, it was viewed as a vital economic lifeline to guarantee government employment for their youth.
And the catalyst for these specific protests was a perceived betrayal of that lifeline. During the 2003 assembly elections, the ruling political party had explicitly promised to grant the community scheduled tribe status.
Right.
When that promise did not materialize after the election, the resulting frustration boiled over into the streets. Again, we are reporting on this purely as a matter of historical and socioeconomic record, but it highlights how fiercely administrative labels dictate economic survival.
Those underlying economic and environmental pressures in Rajasthan also triggered some severe demographic adaptations. Our sources note that in the early 2000s, within the Dang region of Rajasthan, the Gurjar community experienced drastically falling sex ratios.
The scarcity of available brides became so acute that it led to documented instances of polyandry within the community,
Yes.
where multiple men would marry a single woman. It's a stark illustration of how environmental scarcity and socioeconomic marginalization can fundamentally alter the core social fabric of a community.
It really is.
So what does this all mean? When you pull the threads of this deep dive together, the Gurjars stand as a testament to radical human resilience. We are looking at a people deeply embedded in the geography of the subcontinent, literally giving their names to major cities like Gujranwala and Gujarat in Pakistan. Yet they are simultaneously fighting for the basic right to graze cattle in the Himalayan foothills. They are navigating entirely distinct, wildly complex political and legal systems across 3 separate nations, all while maintaining a coherent thread of shared identity.
This raises an important question regarding the nature of the modern state. Our contemporary governments are built on the premise of a sedentary population. They rely on neat categories, hard borders, and fixed addresses.
Right.
How can a system designed around staying still adequately govern or protect a people whose entire history, whose fundamental survival strategy, is built on mobility, fluid identities, and cross-border kin networks? The bureaucratic state constantly tries to put them in a box, but their history proves they have never stayed in one.
It is a profound friction between a mobile past and a walled present. I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. We've examined how they adapted to empires, forced displacements, and modern conservation laws. But looking ahead, climate change is actively altering the geography of the Himalayas and the Thar Desert.
Water sources are drying up and seasonal weather patterns are shifting. How will a traditionally nomadic and pastoral community adapt to a physically changing Earth? How will they alter ancient migration routes to survive the next century? Will climate change do what empires and borders couldn't and finally force the Gurjars to stop moving? It's something to think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.